Yeah, I think there's an obvious need to fill, or they feel there's a need to fill the ideological vacuum left by the collapse of the prevailing ideology, in which many people, even after the collapse, continue in many ways to believe. And there are aspects of what was Soviet socialism, if you want to call it, which existing socialism, levels of equality, which make people more acutely critical of the huge inequalities which have occurred. And the main problem is, what is Russianness? What are we about? Where are we? Particularly in terms of relations with near abroad. I mean, Ukraine, Russia is almost part of the same society and same country. You've got to distinguish one from another. Where are we between Europe and China? And one of the great claims, of course, lies in this rather strange word Eurasian, as a Eurasian identity of nationalism, which is not quite Russian nationalism, but means that Russia thinks of itself as entitled to be a great power of the world kind because it's the bridge between a greater Europe and China, particularly as China is now seen to be as the ascendant power. The United States is on the whole regarded by the nationalists as being in decline, not just by the nationalists in Russia, but more broadly than that. So I think they're searching around for some ideational basis which would give them a Russian purpose at home, unite and solidify people at home, and behind the regime. And many people support the regime partly because it's raised Russia's pride again, self-respect, influence in the world. And at the same time to impress the world with the fact that here is an indispensable, inherent great power which is going to help you bridge relations between Europe and China. And in some senses, even to protect you against China if things should get bad, because we are the eastern edge of the greater Europe. One way to try and undermine what I think could be a damaging appeal to nationalism, which can turn nasty, is to do what I was saying, try to include them in a greater Europe. Call the bluff, say, okay, if you really are a European country, which is on the whole the inclination of most of the elite, not an Asian country or Eurasian, is a Eurasian country. If you're European, come and play a responsible part in a greater Europe. And responsibility means observing the sovereignty of other European states, such as Ukraine. So I think that we could take advantage of that, but it's certainly something which the regime, the elite are working on very hard. And some of the more extreme, Dugin, Panarin, examples of Eurasianism have not yet seeped into the main line, but some of their ideas over the years have crept into the vocabulary.
Right. So I think what's interesting is actually even in the European camp, it's a different kind of Europeanism to that which we saw in the 90s. I don't think they're interested in joining NATO anymore. I don't think they want to be in our institutions. And lots of Russian intellectuals now talk about Russia as the other European Union. So they're actually self-consciously modelling their identity as an alternative, a counterpoint, a mirror image to our European Union, where sovereign democracy replaces liberal democracy, where state capitalism takes the place of market capitalism, where the balance of power and spheres of influence will replace the kind of ceding of sovereignty which we have in our European Union. I think that takes us back to the very beginning. I think the debate about, Russia is always obsessed with its identity, and Russians are constantly trying to define themselves and to try and work out how they fit into the rest of the world and how they make sense of their own history. But I do think they've turned the page, and they're not interested in being part of our Europe or being or subjugating themselves to our standards or implementing our norms. They're trying to develop an alternative now.
I just wanted to put the last question, and I'll end up with you, Edward. And that is whether Russia. We've all talked, and everybody, even Mark, has been pessimistic about the present state of Russia. What do you think is going to happen in 2 sentences? How is it going to go? How is it going to survive the downturn? Or is it not? Is the regime not going to survive the downturn?
Well, the Russians themselves are convinced that their mystical salvation, that somehow there's something inherent about the spirit of the Russian people that will see them through. Unfortunately, I have no real better prognosis which way the camp will jump, whether it will be whether liberalism will prevail or whether there will be a nasty nationalism. I fear the worst, but I hope for the best.
The scholar's answer.
First of all, it takes a lot to bring down a regime. It took an awful lot to bring down the Soviet regime, much more than one would think. All our prognostications of Weimar Russia didn't come out. although all the conditions were there, and had it happened, it would have been overdetermined, almost. I don't think that we're going to see any sharp changes. The regime is not going to collapse under the pressure of the Great Recession, but I think reform will come, as it's done in all ways for the past 70 years, from within. The elite is big enough and compendious enough to have people within it who argue on pragmatic, self-serving grounds that you'll be better off with this way of doing things rather than the old way, which is going to break you. You're going to lose a lot of your fortune. So they're going to gradually make it work in a more effective feedback fashion. Not a lot of choice between parties, but make United Russia, which is the kind of attempt at recreating a state party, which doesn't work very well, more internally differentiated eventually. That probably gives us a differentiation, not democracy, but an easier authoritarianism, and I think it will be done for reasons of pragmatism. In terms of internationally, I do think, perhaps I'm over-optimistic, that they do admire Europe. They do admire the EU. They don't like to say it. It's the one organisation which has enlarged and imposed conditionality with some effectiveness. American democracy promotion has been an abject failure. Conditionality has been a partial success at least. And they do want to see themselves part, not of NATO or of the EU, but of a new European architecture, where they think of themselves as founder members, of course, which they're not. There's going to be another myth. But let's create another greater European myth and take that forward.
I think they like sending their kids to European schools. I think they like going to Europe for their holidays, whether it's skiing or going to the south of France or to Greek islands on their holidays. But I don't think they want to become part of the European Union. I agree that
Just like us.
I think actually many people in Russia talk about the European Union as a kind of latter-day Soviet Union, a kind of utopian, multi-ethnic, multinational political project built on feet of clay, which they think will collapse. I think they've got this completely wrong, and that they've overestimated European Union's problems and massively underestimated their own. But that's another question. In terms of the system, I sort of agree that it takes 75 years for a Soviet system that failed in theory to actually fail in practice. And the Russians are pretty resilient, having been through the last 20 years. I mean, it would be very difficult for things to be as bad as they were in living memory, even with a lower oil price and a financial crisis. So I suspect that the system will survive, and I think there will be reforms, as there have been in the past. I think part of the problem is, for us, reform means becoming like us. It means moving in a single direction. In fact, the system which you have now is totally different from the system 5 years ago. It will be completely different in another 5 years. But I don't think it will be more liberal or more like Western Europe than it is at the moment.
Edward, you wish to sum up?
Yes, I think what this regime has done is to hollow out all the institutions of state. So we have courts that aren't proper courts, parliament isn't proper parliament, civil service isn't proper civil service, local government isn't proper local government. And I think that's created a kind of stability without stabilisers, and I think there's at least a chance, and certainly some very serious scholars of this in Moscow think there's a chance of disintegration of the Russian Federation, at least some bits, North Caucasus, possibly the Far East, becoming less connected to the centre than they have been before, and that's quite dangerous. I think Russia's been very good at playing divide and rule in Europe and will continue to do it. I think the idea that we can bring them into a new European security architecture is a terrible one, because there is one already. It's called the ISCE, and Russia systematically goes out of its way to obstruct it, starve its institutions of budgets, and generally be a nuisance. It's a fundamental condition of participation in a European security organisation. You respect the sovereignties of the other countries. When you have Putin saying to Ukraine, you're not a proper country, and if you join NATO, we'll dismember you. That doesn't seem to me to be a healthy precondition. So therefore, I think, again, that the most important thing we can do is to try and do what we can through the EU's Eastern Partnership and every other institution that's there to try and protect and consolidate and strengthen the countries around Russia, while continuing to maintain what we can of relationship with Russia, and particularly with Russians outside the regime.
Thank you very much.